Idi Amin Dada ruled Uganda from 1971 to 1979. In the years since, he has evolved into a figure surrounded by mystery and legend. More than 4 decades after his removal from power and nearly 2 decades after his death, he continues to be a powerful reference point in Ugandan culture and politics. Globally, his name has come to symbolize the extreme brutality and madness often associated with African dictatorships. Fitting for a figure so steeped in legend, even the basic details of Amin's life, his birth date, birthplace, and parentage remain uncertain. Most historical accounts place his birth between 1925 and 1928, near the town of Kiboko in Uganda's West Nile district, close to the borders with Congo and Sudan. These accounts describe his father as a Muslim from the Kakwa ethnic group and his mother as a member of the neighboring Lugbara community. The Kakwa belonged to the wider Nubian nation, a collection of tribes with origins in Sudan's Nubian desert. Idi Amin's Nubian forebears were brought into Uganda as mercenaries serving local warlords. Idi Amin's father, Andreas Nyabayar, was born in 1889 and brought up as a Catholic. After converting to Islam in 1910, he adopted the name Amin Dada. Like his father, Idi Amin was born into both the Nubi and Kakwa communities. He grew up in and around the camps of the 4th Battalion of the King's African Rifles, as well as in Uganda's largest city, Kampala. During his childhood, Amin experienced racial discrimination, which he later described as deeply painful. He remembered how both he and his mother were excluded from social interactions with the British because of their race. Although he admired the British soldiers and was eager to gain their approval, these experiences also fostered resentment toward them, a hostility that would later surface in his political outlook as a ruler. Amin possessed an imposing physical presence, tall and powerful, that would later become central to his public personality. In colonial Uganda, British authorities typically recruited soldiers from rural areas, prioritizing physical strength over formal education. This approach opened the door for men like Amin who were loyal, disciplined, and ready to obey orders. In 1946, Idi Amin enlisted in the King's African Rifles, the British colonial force in East Africa, marking a turning point in his life. He distinguished himself during British military operations in Kenya and Somalia. Notably, he took part in the campaign against the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, earning promotion to the rank of Effendi in the King's African Rifles, comparable to a warrant officer in the regular British Army. At the time, this was the highest rank available to a black African, as commissioned officer status under the Queen was reserved exclusively for whites. When Britain established Uganda as a colonial entity in the late 19th century, it did so with strategic interests firmly in mind. As the world's leading imperial power at the time, Britain valued Uganda primarily because it lay at the source of the Nile, control of which meant influence over Egypt, the Suez Canal, and ultimately the most direct route to India, the centerpiece of Britain's empire. Owing to these priorities, Uganda's borders were drawn with little regard for the people living there. As a result, colonial boundaries ignored existing ethnic and tribal territories, many of which extended across what are now the neighboring states of Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, Kenya, Tanzania, and Rwanda. Within the newly formed state of Uganda existed 4 ancient kingdoms. Buganda, the most influential, alongside Bunyoro, Ankole, and Toro, each ruled by its own monarch. The most prominent of these rulers was the Kabaka of Buganda, the dominant kingdom from whose name Uganda itself is derived. These 4 kingdoms occupied the southern region of the country, the most fertile and productive area. The south was also home to several smaller ethnic groups, including the Bakiga, Bajisu, Bakiti, and Basoga. Ethnically and linguistically, the peoples of southern Uganda were largely Bantu. When British colonial forces arrived in the late 19th century, they discovered that the southern regions, already organized under stable social and political systems, were comparatively straightforward to govern. These territories were incorporated as provinces within the empire, and their monarchs effectively assumed the role of provincial administrators. Provided they maintained order with the support of British officials, they were largely permitted to govern without interference. In this arrangement, the Kabaka of Buganda continued to stand out as a preeminent ruler among the kings. The British also played a key role in bringing Asians to Uganda. They were initially recruited to construct the Kenya-Uganda Railway, which was intended to transport troops to safeguard the Nile source from the imperial ambitions of rival European powers such as France, Belgium, and Germany. Although the railway was never used for military purposes, it provided Asians with opportunities to establish commercial networks. Over time, they emerged as the merchant middle class of Uganda and, more broadly, of British East Africa. Apollo Milton Obote, Uganda's first prime minister, was born in 1925 in Lango, northern Uganda, the son of a colonial-era chief. He received his early education in Lango, Akoli, and Busoga before enrolling at Makerere College, then the country's only university. While there, he earned scholarships to study law in the United States and economics in the United Kingdom, prompting him to leave Makerere in preparation for overseas study. However, the British Provincial Commissioner of Uganda's northern province blocked both opportunities, arguing that education abroad would not make Obote useful to the country. As a result, he abandoned his studies and moved to Kenya, where he worked as a clerk on a sugar plantation and became politically active through trade unions and the Kenyan African Union. During this time, he was linked to providing logistical support to Mau Mau fighters, which led to his arrest and detention. After his release in 1957, Obote returned to Uganda and joined the Uganda National Congress. He was elected to the Legislative Council in 1958 and quickly rose to prominence, in large part because Baganda representatives viewed him as one of the few northern politicians who respected their culture, autonomy, and their king. Uganda gained independence on October 9, 1962, with Obote assuming the role of prime minister, initially backed by the influential Kabaka of Buganda, who went on to become president the following year. The most pressing challenge confronting newly independent Uganda was the dispute over the lost counties, territories that had originally belonged to Bunyoro but had been absorbed into Buganda. In the 1890s, the British, assisted by the Kabaka of Buganda, defeated Bunyoro and rewarded the Kabaka with a portion of Bunyoro's land. Based on the 1900 Buganda Agreement and historical expansion, Buganda annexed 7 counties from Bunyoro, commonly known as the Lost Counties. This transfer was deeply resented by the Bunyoro. Conveniently, the British left the issue unresolved at independence, passing it on to the new government. Under the Independence Constitution, a referendum was to be held within 2 years to allow residents of the Lost Counties to choose which region they wished to join. The reigning Kabaka had little desire to hold such a vote, knowing that the Bunyoro would almost certainly choose to return to Bunyoro rather than remain under Buganda rule. Obote, however, pushed for the referendum, which took place in 1964. As expected, Buganda lost the counties to Bunyoro, and the fragile alliance between Obote and the Kabaka quickly unraveled. This rift between Prime Minister and President ultimately set Uganda on a path that led to the collapse of democratic governance. At the same time, Amin had not yet entered politics, but he was beginning to attract national attention in other ways. During this period, the Belgian Congo, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, was engulfed in a prolonged civil war. One phase of the conflict, which was nearing its end after 6 years, carried particular importance for both Uganda and Amin. Rebel groups sympathetic to Obote were still battling the new Congolese government led by Moise Tshombe and Mobutu Sese Seko, then Chief of Staff and later President. As Mobutu's forces pushed the rebels toward the Ugandan border, Obote sought to support them as fully as possible. He entrusted Amin, by then deputy commander of the Ugandan army, with direct responsibility for aiding the rebels in and around Amin's home region of Arua. To do so, Obote communicated directly with Amin, bypassing the army commander, Brigadier Shaban Obote. This approach was taken both to keep Amin's operations highly secret and because Obote viewed Obote as a possible ally of his longtime rival, the Kabaka. The rebels frequently traveled to Entebbe, where they stayed at Amin's residence and met with Obote. What they needed most were weapons and transportation. Lacking cash, they instead possessed large quantities of gold and ivory taken from towns they had previously held before retreating. Acting as their intermediary, Amin arranged the sale of this gold and ivory and used the proceeds to procure arms on their behalf. Amin's transactions involving Congolese gold and ivory were never formally documented. The materials were delivered directly to his home by truck, and he was not required to report or justify any sales. As a result, he began depositing substantial amounts of cash into his own accounts, often as much as 300,000 shillings at a time, eventually totaling close to $1 million. To avoid drawing attention, he also kept significant sums of money stored in his house. Reports of Amin's sudden wealth soon began to surface. A member of parliament, Daudi Oking, circulated photocopies of Amin's account at the Ottoman Bank during a parliamentary session and called for a formal investigation. This sparked a debate, after which an inquiry was approved. Not long after, however, Obote moved to consolidate power, detaining 5 ministers, 4 of whom backed the allegations against Amin, suspending the constitution, removing the Kabaka, and assuming the presidency himself. The investigation threatened to be politically damaging for Obote, so he intervened by persuading several Congolese rebels living in exile in Uganda to testify in Amin's favor and clear him of wrongdoing. In protecting Amin, Obote preserved the very man who would later depose him. At the time, however, Amin appeared crucial to Obote's survival. A decisive confrontation with the Kabaka was looming, and Amin's loyalty seemed essential. Although Amin remained only the deputy commander, Obote no longer trusted the army commander, Obote, who had by then married into the Buganda royal family. As a result, Amin became the president's sole dependable option. On May 22, 1966, Obote ordered the arrest of several of the Kabaka's leading supporters. As word of the detention spread, government vehicles were attacked with stones, and the Kabaka's followers erected roadblocks on routes linking his palace, just outside Kampala, to the capital. Without swift intervention, Uganda was poised to declare independence, leaving the central government facing the humiliating prospect of being forced out of its own capital. Later that same day, Obote convened a meeting at the President's Lodge in Kampala. Present were Obote himself, the Inspector General of Police, the Chief General Service Officer, the Minister of Internal Affairs, and the Minister of Defense. Following deliberations, Obote informed the ministers that the unrest had escalated beyond a civilian issue and now required a military response. Unbeknownst to the ministers, Obote had already alerted Amin. He then called him and instructed him to report immediately to the President's Lodge. Amin arrived shortly afterward in uniform and was given verbal orders to assault the palace the next morning and place the Kabaka under arrest. At the same time, supporters of the Kabaka, determined to safeguard him, flooded into the palace grounds. At dawn the following day, Amin's forces launched their assault. The Kabaka appears to have received advance warning, as his supporters were armed and mounted an unexpectedly strong resistance that lasted several hours. By 3:30 p.m., Amin drove to the President's Lodge in an open jeep fitted with a 6-foot-long 122mm gun to brief Obote and request authorization to bombard the Kabaka's main residence. In high spirits and clearly relishing the battle, he received approval, leapt back into his vehicle and sped away. Within minutes, two powerful explosions rocked the compound. Artillery shells tore through the Kabaka's main official residence, sending thick plumes of smoke into the air. Then, as though on cue, a torrential downpour began, bringing the fighting to a sudden halt. When the storm subsided, troops advanced swiftly in search of the Kabaka. Around 5:30 p.m., Amin returned to the President's Lodge in high spirits, carrying what he described as trophies, the Kabaka's presidential flag and the ceremonial cap signifying his role as Commander-in-Chief of the Uganda Army. He claimed he was uncertain whether the Kabaka had been killed or had managed to flee. In reality, the Kabaka had used the chaos of the storm to escape through a side entrance into a nearby house. From there, he eventually made his way into exile in Burundi and later to Britain, where he died 3 years afterward. Amin had by this point become Obote's clear favorite. With his civilian political base greatly weakened, Obote was increasingly dependent on the army, which had emerged as a powerful force in its own right, backed and trained largely by Israel and Britain. Amin appeared to be a safe choice for trust. He was almost illiterate and displayed no obvious political aspirations. In fact, Obote's concerns were directed not at Amin but at several younger officers trained by the British and Israelis. He believed Amin would serve as a protective buffer against any ambitions they might harbor. Within only a few months, Uganda had shifted from a relatively stable democracy to a system that closely resembled military rule. With the Kabaka removed and the Baganda subdued by force, Obote could no longer count on forming a durable parliamentary majority. Hundreds of notable figures were detained without trial, among them the former army commander Shaban Obote. Amin's dominance during this period enabled him to strengthen the network of alliances that he would later use to tighten his grip on the country. In backing the Congolese rebels, he recruited numerous Nubians and southern Sudanese, many of whom were themselves engaged in rebellion against their own government. He initially chose them because they were loyal to him and came from the northwestern border region where the operations were centered, giving them a direct stake in the conflict. Beyond this, Amin and the southern Sudanese shared common interests. He supported them in their protracted civil war against the Sudanese government, and in return they provided him with a dependable, ready-made force that was gradually integrated into various units of the Ugandan army. Some were even placed within the General Service Unit, the intelligence body closely tied to President Obote, where they supplied Amin with crucial information. Their advancement in the military depended entirely on Amin, fostering personal loyalty to him rather than to Obote. For 3 years, Amin remained essential to the regime. Yet, as Obote increasingly recognized, he was also becoming a mounting danger. Their growing rivalry eventually broke into open hostility in December 1969. On December 19th of that year, Obote attended an evening gathering of the Uganda People's Congress at a hall in Kampala. When the meeting concluded, an enthusiastic crowd trailed behind him, applauding and celebrating what they saw as a successful event. As Obote approached within a few feet of a tree along his path, a gunshot was fired. The assailant had concealed himself behind the tree, likely bracing his pistol against a low branch to steady his aim. It was later revealed that Obote had sustained only minor injuries to his mouth in the attack. In the aftermath of the shooting, military and security forces erected roadblocks across Uganda, and amid the uncertainty, a pattern of repression swiftly took shape. In early January, once fully recovered, Obote convened a meeting of the Defense Council. During the session, Amin's deputy, Brigadier Okoya, accused Amin of cowardice and abandoning his post during the assassination attempt. The meeting descended into chaos and was adjourned, with plans to reconvene on Monday, January 26. However, on Friday, January 23, Okoya and his wife were shot dead by unknown assailants near their home in Gulu, the Akoli capital. Suspicion quickly fell on Amin, though the police inquiry failed to produce clear results. Throughout 1970, speculation swirled over who was responsible for both the attempt on Obote's life and Okoya's killing, with Amin widely regarded as a prime suspect. Later that year, several men arrested for an armed robbery confessed to murdering Brigadier Okoya, stating they had been paid by an Air Force officer allegedly acting on Amin's orders. Their trial was set for February 1971. Tensions within the army were steadily mounting. Beginning in 1969, Obote effectively split the military along ethnic lines. As president and chairman of the Defense Council, he leaned heavily on Nilotic soldiers, particularly from the Akoli and Lengo communities. Amin, meanwhile, consolidated his backing among fellow West Nilers. Some of Obote's actions appeared to further inflame discontent, especially the significant expansion in 1969 of Akina Adoko's General Service Unit, GSU. Adoko, both a poet and Obote's cousin, was widely viewed by many officers as strengthening the GSU into a Lengi-dominated force capable of rivaling the army. Through a series of measures, Obote seemed to undermine the regular military by promoting parallel armed bodies perceived as competitors. In addition to the GSU, he supported the creation of an armed police wing known as the Special Force. Both units were seen by army personnel as receiving preferential treatment in the allocation of weapons, equipment, and recruits. Ultimately, however, the deeper issue was the widening divide and intensifying rivalry between Obote and Amin. As the number of West Nilers in the military increased and Amin's influence expanded, Obote made the risky decision to try to reassert control over the army. Though Amin lacked formal education, he had become highly sensitive to the realities of political survival in Uganda, where the calculated use of force often determined who held power. In many ways, this was a lesson he had absorbed from Obote himself. Despite his simplicity, Amin possessed a natural ability to connect with ordinary people. By speaking directly to communities in Luganda and other local languages, he was able to build rapport at the grassroots level, particularly within the former kingdoms. By mid-1970, Amin appeared to command broader popular support than Obote, particularly in Uganda. Remarkably, many Baganda began to view the same man who had led the assault on their king's palace, and whose troops had looted and damaged their property, as a potential redeemer. In September 1970, Obote dispatched Amin as his official representative to the funeral of Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Seizing the opportunity created by Amin's absence, Obote initiated a sweeping reorganization of the military. He advanced all officers by one rank and established new chiefs of staff for both the Army and the Air Force, making them answerable directly to the President's office rather than to Amin, who was reduced to a largely ceremonial commander-in-chief. Officers suspected of loyalty to Amin were reassigned away from influential positions, while some were transferred into civil service roles. When Amin returned, his relationship with Obote had completely broken down, and both sides began preparing for the other's removal. Highly conscious of the risk of arrest, Amin surrounded himself constantly with loyal security personnel. Obote was well aware that a coup could occur at any moment. In January 1971, he was scheduled to attend a Commonwealth conference in Singapore. Before departing on January 11th, he left Amin with a memorandum outlining 2 urgent issues that required clarification. The first related to the police investigation into the murder of Brigadier Okoya and his wife, a report that implicated Amin. The second matter was equally serious. Amin was asked to explain the disappearance of a significant sum of money spent by the Ministry of Defense that had not been properly accounted for. Obote's charge that Amin had misused defense funds, and his demand that the money be properly accounted for, carried a certain irony. Yet for Amin, the allegation struck a deeply personal blow. He regarded it as fundamentally unjust. To him, the accusation was not a genuine pursuit of accountability but a calculated maneuver designed to damage his standing and undermine his reputation. While outsiders may not have grasped the full context, Amin believed the move was a deliberate attempt to discredit him. The general was left with an unmistakable dilemma: wait for Obote to move against him or act before it was too late. The decisive moment came when a message ordering Amin's arrest upon Obote's return was intercepted at the Jinja barracks by one of Amin's trusted soldiers. Realizing that his position was in immediate danger, Amin chose to strike first. He set in motion a swift and coordinated operation to seize control of the government. In the early hours of January 25, 1971, bursts of gunfire rang out across Kampala. Troops loyal to Amin, largely drawn from West Nile, Southern Sudanese and Nubian ranks, moved rapidly to secure key strategic points throughout the city. Parliament was cordoned off, Radio Uganda was surrounded, and military units established roadblocks to block any potential response from forces still loyal to Obote. It quickly became evident that Amin had succeeded in sidelining resistance within the military. By mid-morning, Uganda was firmly under army control, with Amin emerging as its leader. At 4 p.m. that afternoon, an officer later identified as Warrant Officer Sam Wilfred Aswa went on air to announce that the armed forces had assumed control of the nation. In defending their takeover, the military accused Obote of corruption, regional bias, and poor economic leadership.
The members of the Uganda Army and Air Force decided to take over from the civilian role because of the last arrangement which were made by the Dr. Milton Obote to disarm the whole tribe of Uganda except his own tribe Langi and Acholi. And also, that is the point which brought all this problem.
The coup of 1971 marked the beginning of a new chapter in Uganda's history. What began as hope would soon turn into fear, because once Idi Amin secured power, he refused to let it go. This video marks part 1 of a deeper series examining the rise of a dictator. In the next installment, I'll explore Amin's rule over Uganda, what unfolded immediately after the coup and how he maintained power for 8 years. If you enjoy detailed historical documentaries on Africa's political past, be sure to subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.